What happens when you achieve everything you've ever dreamed of, but discover your soul continues to scream with hunger? Today, we'll perform a spiritual autopsy on the mind of Solomon, the man who turned gold to dust and wisdom to nihilism. You'll understand why unlimited wealth can become your worst curse. Stay tuned and discover the dark secret behind the throne. Wait to see the downfall of a genius, and don't miss the cure for the emptiness that money can't fill. The scent emanating from the inner courtyards of the Cedar Palace is not the sweet perfume of Ophir spices, but a heavy odor of burnt lamp oil and the metallic trail of gold coins that have passed through hands too sweaty to find rest. For 40 years, the rhythmic beat of chariots and the sound of hammers on fine gold have created a symphony of progress the world had never seen, a certainty that heaven's favor translated into overflowing warehouses and tables groaning under the weight of foreign delicacies. The man who sits on the ivory throne overlaid with pure gold feels the coldness of the material pierce his linen robes, his long fingers adorned with heavy rings, tapping nervously against the arm sculpted in the shape of a lion. He watches the dust dancing in a ray of light that cuts through the dimness of the royal hall. And he's realizing that, despite having built the dwelling place of God and the greatest fortress on earth, he now inhabits a territory where silence is louder than the cries of merchants. The harsh, merciless sunlight of Jerusalem reflects off the golden shields hanging on the walls, creating a glare that hurts the eyes of anyone trying to find meaning beyond the superficial glint of wealth. Solomon, David's son, whose name once evoked the sound of peace and harmony, now carries the gaze of one who has traversed every labyrinth of pleasure and discovered that each corridor ends in a blind, mute limestone wall. He watches the servants moving with the precision of automatons, their bare feet making an almost imperceptible sound on the polished marble, while the king tries to recall the taste of water from a simple well that wasn't brought in goblets of precious stones. An existential nausea begins to seep from the cracks in his wisdom, a visceral realization that the intelligence that solved the dilemmas of nations is the same that now dissects his own unhappiness with the precision of a rusty scalpel. We always imagine this king as a figure of absolute serenity, surrounded by unwavering divine glory. But the reality hidden within his writings reveals a man with trembling hands and a mind besieged by the realization that excess is a silent form of hunger. The temple's gleam, with its gold-covered walls, now seems a constant reminder of a contract of sanctity that has been exchanged piece by piece for political alliances and the perfumes of gods who know no mercy. And he feels the roughness of the parchment beneath his fingers as he tries to write what his soul cries out for, but the words seem like ashes blown away by the wind before they even touch the surface, leaving only the taste of vanity in his mouth. The nightmare did not begin with a foreign invasion or a coup d'etat, but with the silence of a life that obtained everything it desired and, in the process, lost the capacity to desire anything that truly matters. As the shadows of the columns stretch across the stone floor, the richest man who ever walked the dust of Judea realizes that his wisdom has become a curse, preventing him from being content with the illusions that sustain other men. He hears the laughter of a worker in the street, someone whose sweat on his brow is the price of an honest loaf of bread, and feels an envy that makes him clench his fists until his nails leave marks on his palms. The thesis of this journey is not about how to conquer the world, but about how to survive the moment when the world finally surrenders to you and reveals that it has nothing solid to offer your spirit. Solomon now walks towards the balcony, where the desert wind carries the scent of dust and freedom, but he remains trapped within an armor of luxury that he himself forged, with each decision to prioritize gold over the altar. The afternoon sun now strikes the palace floor with an aged copper hue, revealing the thin layer of dust that has settled on the acacia wood furniture that Solomon once had polished until it reflected the sky itself. Each step he takes on the cold marble resonates like a heartbeat in an empty hall, a cadence that reminds him that the peace he built for Israel was erected on the foundation of a silence that now consumes him from within. He approaches a side table where a wine jug rests, observing the dark, sticky residue at the bottom of the metal, a perfect image of a life that drank from every source and now finds only the bitter sediment of repetition. Solomon's mind, trained to discern the nature of trees from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop sprouting on the wall, begins to apply that same relentless logic to his own soul, realizing that he has become a botanist of his own spiritual decay. He remembers the time when fear was a living fire that kept him awake during the night watches. But now that fire has been replaced by the artificial heat of 1,000 oil lamps that illuminate his wealth, but leave his spirit in a darkness that no gold can dispel. The trembling in his hands is not a result of the weakness of age, but of the unbearable weight of carrying the expectations of a world that sees him as the personification of success, while he feels like an architect who has built a magnificent cathedral only to discover that the altar is empty. Solomon watches a group of foreign merchants crossing the distant courtyard, their colorful clothes and strange languages a reminder of the alliances he stitched together with the blood of his original commitment to the sacred. He tastes ashes in his mouth as he realizes that each foreign wife he brought to Jerusalem came accompanied by an altar that now fractures the unity of his heart, creating a spiritual noise that prevents him from hearing the gentle voice that once called to him in Gibeon. The psychology of having everything one desires has produced in him a paralysis of the will, a state where instant gratification has corroded the capacity to wait for something eternal, transforming the king of Israel into a prisoner of his own satiated appetites. He leans over the rough stone parapet, feeling the coarse texture against the palm of his hand, a welcome contrast to the cloying softness of the silks that surround him all day. Down below, the city breathes, but Solomon feels disconnected from the pulse of his people, as if the gold had created an insulating barrier that prevents human pain and joy from reaching his heart. Perhaps you too feel this same coldness, not for lack of resources, but for the terrifying discovery that an abundance of things can create a scarcity of meaning, transforming your life into an inventory of achievements that do not warm your spirit on nights of doubt. Solomon's diagnosis is not financial, but existential. He has discovered that the human heart is an infinite abyss that tries to be filled with finite things, and the result of this equation is always a painful remnant of nothingness. The next step in his journey will not be towards more achievements, but a forced dive into the deep waters of his own dissatisfaction, where he hopes to find what remained of the man before the crown devoured him completely. The shadows of the date palms in the courtyard now stretch like dark fingers attempting to touch the base of the throne, while Solomon observes the gleam of a small sapphire set in his ring, realizing that the stone is cold, hard, and utterly indifferent to his inner torment. He remembers when wisdom was a tool of justice, a gift that brought clarity to the chaos of widows and orphans. But now that same lucidity has turned against him, illuminating every crack in his own hypocrisy with the precision of a midday sun in the desert. The weight of the golden crown on his brow is not merely physical. It is a constant pressure that seems to crush the purest thoughts, replacing simple devotion with a political complexity that has transformed the temple of God into a monument to his own administrative prowess. He smells the sweat of his own servants passing by, carrying silver trays, a human and real odor that makes him feel a painful longing for when he himself was just a young man whose heart beat in sync with the promises of his father. David. The nausea that overwhelms him doesn't stem from what he lacks, but from the suffocating excess of everything he possesses, a saturation that has numbed his senses and transformed pleasure into a bureaucratic and lifeless task. The fine dust that enters through the high windows of the palace gleams like suspended gold, but for the king, it is merely a visual reminder that everything he has built is destined to turn to dust, no matter how deep the hewn stone foundations he ordered laid. He observes the almost imperceptible tremor in his own purple robe. It's a sign of an anxiety that cannot be appeased by armies or treasures hidden in store cities, but which is born from the spiritual void of a man who has stopped looking upwards and only looks to the sides. The psychology of accumulation has created in him an illusion of control that now crumbles, revealing that control is the cruelest of lies when the heart is fragmented among 1,000 gods of stone and wood who cannot answer its silent cry. Perhaps his own weariness today is not from overwork, but from an excess of distractions he has piled upon his soul, trying to stifle the sound of a truth that can only be heard in isolation and lack. Solomon realizes that true poverty is not an empty hand, but a soul full of things that lack eternity, a state of mind where meaning has been exchanged for utility and worship has been replaced by ostentation. He rises from the throne, the sound of his heavy robes dragging across the polished floor sounding like a lament, and walks to the darkest corner of the hall, where the torchlight has not yet reached the coldness of the walls. There, in the silence that precedes night, he begins to mentally strip himself of his glory, trying to find the trace of the God who spoke to him in dreams, but finds only the echo of his own voice, repeating proverbs that he himself can no longer practice. The conflict between what he knows and what he lives has become an open wound that no balm of Gilead can close, a dissonance that makes him feel like a stranger within his own sacred heritage. And the thesis of his life now boils down to a bitter discovery. Wisdom without presence is merely a catalogue of sorrows, an encyclopedia of how man can fail even with the treasure map in his hands, soiled with ambition. He touches the cold stone of the wall and closes his eyes, hoping that the darkness will bring him the vision that the light of gold stole from him. A glimpse that the end of all things is far more urgent than the brilliance of any majestic beginning. The wind blowing from the mountains of Moab carries with it the scent of incense burning on strange altars, an aroma that mingles with the cedar perfume of the palace and creates a fog of confusion in the king's mind, who now feels the weight of every political compromise that has distanced him from the exclusivity of the altar. Solomon watches the flame of a single torch flicker violently, casting distorted shadows against the tapestries that narrate victories that now seem empty, realizing that he has become a master at building temples for the God of his father, while his own heart has transformed into a museum of foreign idols. He touches the surface of an ebony table, feeling the black, impenetrable wood as the barrier that has risen between his intelligence and his peace, a darkness that no theological explanation can illuminate, because the problem is not the lack of light, but the blindness of one who has become intoxicated with his own glory. Cold sweat trickles down his back beneath the fine linen, a biological reaction to the silent panic of discovering that wisdom, when disconnected from obedience, becomes a magnifying glass for one's own misery, more transforming life into a succession of pleasures that can no longer numb the pain of simply being human. The atmosphere in the royal hall is heavy with a tension that the servants cannot name, but which they feel in the trembling of the king's hands and in the lost gaze he casts beyond the walls of Jerusalem, as if searching for a Solomon who got lost somewhere between the first prayer and the 1,000th talent of gold. He sees the metallic gleam of the bronze shields and feels a heartbreaking longing for the simplicity of a tent in the desert, where the presence of God did not depend on marble columns, but on the sincerity of a heart that had nothing to offer but its own neediness. The psychology of absolute success has produced in him a spiritual isolation, where he is adored by many, but known by no one, a gilded solitude that makes him feel like an ornate corpse inside a sarcophagus of precious jewels. Perhaps his pursuit of more recognition and more financial security is merely his way of trying to fill the silence of a God he has stopped listening to, because the noise of his own achievements has become too loud to allow intimacy. Solomon realizes that the cost of having everything was the loss of the ability to be satisfied with what is essential. A tragic exchange where he gained the world, but began to feel the slow and inevitable fading of his own soul. He approaches a large, polished bronze mirror and stares at the reflection of a man who possesses knowledge of all things, yet cannot answer why his sleep is haunted by ghosts of regret, and why the gold in his coffers seems to weigh more than the lead in his chest. At the central theme of his agony is the confrontation with finitude. He realizes that, for an eternal being, nothing that has an end can be considered a treasure, and that all his accumulation is merely a futile effort to grasp the wind with his hands. He closes his eyes against the glow of the lamps, trying to find a trace of that holy tremor he felt when the cloud of glory filled the temple, but finds only the dry echo of rituals he now performs like a weary actor on a stage that no longer fascinates him. The true danger of having everything is not what you possess, but what you possess begins to possess in you, transforming the owner into a slave and the king into a prisoner of his own luxurious infrastructure. Solomon takes a deep breath, feeling the heavy air of Jerusalem, and understands that the only way out of the labyrinth of vanity is to return to the point where man recognizes himself as dust, before the dust finally reclaims what remains of his empire. The metallic clang of gold coins being counted in the underground treasuries echoes through the cracks in the marble floor, rising like a persistent whisper that Solomon can no longer ignore, reminding him that each accumulated talent is a new weight on the structure of his integrity. He observes the trail of oil that dripped from a bronze lamp onto a cedar table, creating a dark stain that refuses to come off, just like the feeling that his soul has been marked by commitments he should never have signed with the royal ring. The sweat on his neck is cold, but contrasting with the stifling heat of the hall, where the scent of new linen and spice dust creates an atmosphere of suffocating luxury that makes him yearn for a breath of fresh air that hasn't passed through the customs of his empire. He realizes that his wisdom, which was once a river quenching the thirst for justice of a people, has now become a stagnant sea of technical information on how to maintain a consumption machine that no longer serves God, but only its own maintenance. The psychology of excess transformed his mind into a court where he is the judge, the defendant, and the executioner, dissecting his own vanity with the coldness of someone observing carrion under the scorching desert sun. The trembling in his fingers intensifies as he tries to hold a wine goblet, and realizing that the most expensive drink in the lands of Edom tastes like stagnant water when the heart is under spiritual siege. Solomon looks at the marble columns supporting the palace roof and sees in them the image of his own life, imposing and beautiful structures on the outside, but bearing the weight of a leaden sky that seems about to collapse upon his crowned head. He feels the roughness of the wool of his cloak against his skin, a biological reminder that, beneath the layers of purple and gold, he is still made of the same earth as the peasant sleeping in the field, with the tragic difference that the peasant still possesses the luxury of hope. Perhaps you are living the paradox of having reached the top of your personal mountain, only to discover that the air up there is too thin to sustain the life of your joy. Leaving you with the view of a kingdom you no longer have the strength to govern with pleasure. The danger of having everything is that everything ends up filling the empty spaces where God used to dwell, transforming abundance into a security barrier that, ironically, keeps you isolated from the only source of life that truly matters. He steps away from the window and walks toward the center of the hall, where the light from a skylight illuminates the suspended dust, creating a column of brilliance that seems to mock his search for something solid in a world made of reflections and shadows. Solomon realizes that his life's thesis, based on exploring every path under the sun, has led him to a dead end where the knowledge of pain is the only thing that grows without effort or investment. He feels the weight of his rings like precious metal shackles, and understands that the freedom he so desperately sought through power was, in fact, the slow construction of his own cell of isolation and existential boredom. The lesson of his fall is not about the wickedness of gold, but about the insufficiency of anything created to satisfy a desire born in eternity, a hunger that no royal banquet can appease, because the stomach of the soul does not process matter. He closes his eyes and breathes in the heavy air of incense and sweat, feeling the pulse of his own mortality pounding against his temple. A warning that time is the only master whom the great King Solomon cannot bribe with all the treasure of Israel. Or the creaking of the bronze axles of the chariots carrying more silver from Tarshish sounds like a metallic scream in the lower courtyards. But for Solomon, this noise is merely an irritating interference in the vacuum of his own consciousness. He observes the reflection of the sun in a basin of pure water, watching how the liquid stirs with the vibration of the growing city, and realizes that he is like that water, transparent, agitated, but without a root to anchor him to the sacred ground his father once cultivated. The sweat staining the collar of his Egyptian linen tunic carries the weight of 1,000 decisions that prioritized the aesthetics of glory over the ethics of obedience, transforming his skin into a map of anxieties that no anointing oil seems capable of soothing. He smells the dust rising from the wall expansion works, a dust that mingles with his own breath, reminding him that the empire is vast, but human breath is a scarce commodity he is spending to buy emptiness. Solomon's psychology is now that of a man who has discovered that knowledge is a wound that does not heal. The more he understands the mechanics of the world, the less he feels the warmth of the creator of the world, as if intelligence had built a glass dome that protects him from suffering, but also isolates him from life. The light filtering through the stained glass and carved wooden latticework creates geometric patterns on his hands, revealing the network of veins that pulse with the urgency of someone who knows that time is the only resource that doesn't multiply in his storehouses. Solomon looks at a scroll listing proverbs he himself dictated, feeling a corrosive irony as he realizes he is the wisest man on earth and, simultaneously, the most incapable of applying the simplicity of reverence to his own routine. The trembling in his eyelids reflects a nervous exhaustion that doesn't come from manual labor, but from the mental gymnastics of trying to balance the sanctity of the temple with the lust of his harems and the greed of his trade routes. Perhaps you recognize yourself in this fragmentation. They're trying to maintain a facade of success and wisdom, while the foundations of your inner peace are being eroded by commitments you've made to maintain a lifestyle that no longer satisfies you. The danger of being a genius like Solomon is the ease with which the mind creates complex justifications for simple acts of disobedience, transforming sin into a necessity of state and the fall into an intellectual evolution. He rises and walks to the parapet, where the hot southern wind stirs his gray hair, carrying the scent of animal carcasses that died in the desert, a brutal image of finitude that not all the gold of Ophir can mask. Solomon realizes that his legacy, though engraved in gigantic stones and precious metals, is being written in a substance that time devours with cruel speed: the memory of men. He feels a sudden nausea upon understanding that history will remember him for his wealth, and not for his pursuit, for his construction, and not for his heart, as if he had become a luxury extra in the drama of his own existence. The thesis of his life is now an autopsy of frustration. He has discovered that the secret of the universe is not hidden in the libraries he founded, but in the silence of a spirit that needs nothing to be complete. He closes his eyes against the blinding glare of Jerusalem and feels the weight of his own existence, understanding that the crown is an anchor that prevents him from floating in the freedom of the spirit, keeping him trapped at the bottom of an ocean of possessions that he no longer has the breath to sustain. When the rhythmic clinking of silverware being polished in the back of the palace resonates like a countdown to an end that Solomon can already taste, a taste of iron and wasted time. He observes the hands of one of his foreign wives, adorned with Ophir gold and holding a censer that exudes the perfume of gods who have no mouth to speak, but who scream in his ears about his own betrayal. The sweat that beads on his brow is not a result of the arid climate, but of the realization that he has become a stranger in the sanctuary he himself built, a man who knows the exact weight of each sacred object, but has forgotten the weight of the glory that used to inhabit them. He feels the texture of the leather curtains in his room, a dead material that tries to protect a king who no longer finds refuge in sleep, haunted by visions of a kingdom that cracks like the dry soil of Judea under the merciless sun. The psychology of excess created in him a morbid sensitivity, where pleasure is so commonplace that it has become a form of torture, a mechanical repetition that makes him feel like an actor trapped in a play that never closes. The light from the torches reflects off the slaves cleaning the floor, revealing skin glistening with effort, and eyes that, though tired, still possess the gleam of those with a simple goal: survival. Solomon feels a pang of nausea as he realizes that he, with all his wisdom, is the only one in that room who no longer knows where he is going, lost in a labyrinth of sophistication that he himself designed to feel safe. Most he looks at his own reflection in a bronze basin and sees the trail of spiritual decay carved in the lines around his eyes, a geology of broken commitments and prayers that have become political speeches to impress ambassadors. Perhaps you feel this way when you look at your own successes, realizing that the structure you built to be happy has become the barrier that prevents your soul from breathing, transforming your life into an impeccable showcase of a ruined interior. The danger of having all the answers, like Solomon, is that you stop asking the questions that truly matter, transforming spirituality into a set of logical rules while your heart grows cold until it becomes a polished stone. He rises and feels the dizziness of one who lives in a perpetual banquet, where hunger is a theoretical concept and satisfaction is a distant memory. He tries to recover through new luxuries that lose their luster the moment they are acquired. Solomon realizes that his intelligence has become his greatest enemy, creating complex justifications to maintain alliances that distance him from the exclusivity of the altar, as if he could bribe the Creator with the architectural beauty of Jerusalem. He touches the cold surface of a jewel on his tunic, and feels the weight of the responsibility of being the man who had everything, but who is about to leave behind a void that not even 1,000 war horses can fill. The thesis of his agony is the discovery that knowledge without fear is merely an encyclopedia of pain, a cold light that reveals the dirt in the room, but does not offer the necessary strength to clean it. He breathes in the air heavy with expensive perfumes and the fumes of grease, feeling the pulse of his own downfall, and understands that true wisdom is not knowing how to gain the world, but knowing exactly what you cannot afford to lose. The rhythmic echo of bronze hammers working on the foundations of new palaces in Jerusalem sounds like a gavel strike in a trial, where Solomon is simultaneously the executioner and the victim. He observes the limestone dust rising from the construction sites, a white mist settling on the marble and on his own skin, reminding him that the empire is expanding, but his inner territory is shrinking with each new talent of gold that enters through the city gates. The sweat that trickles down his neck, beneath the heavily jeweled collar, carries the metallic odor of anxiety. Oh, it's a biological sign that the king's body can no longer bear the weight of the successful persona he has built for the world. He feels the roughness of the raw wood of a scaffold he forgot to polish, a physical contact with reality that makes him realize how distant his days as a shepherd of souls are, and how close his days as an administrator of vanities are. The psychology of excess has transformed his perception of time. He no longer lives in harvest seasons or sacred festivals, but in cycles of acquisition and boredom, where the novelty of a fleet of Tarshish lasts only as long as it takes to unload the ivory and peacocks. The light filtering through the cracks in the cedar columns draws fiery streaks on the floor, revealing the grime that luxury cannot conceal. The oil stains, the remnants of burnt incense, and the weariness in the eyes of the servants who watch him, with a fear that is no longer respect, but merely dread of power. Solomon looks at his own signet ring and feels a sudden nausea upon realizing that this small piece of metal holds more authority over the fate of thousands than his own conscience holds over his next breath. He realizes that his intelligence, once a beacon to the nations, has become a tool for rationalizing and maintaining a harem of 1,000 women he barely knows, and altars he knows are empty, but which he keeps for political convenience. Perhaps you too are trapped in a successful architecture of your own design, realizing that the walls that should protect you now isolate you from any real intimacy with the sacred, leaving you like a king in a castle of mirrors. And the danger of being the wisest man in the world is that you stop learning how to be a son, turning spirituality into an exercise in logic, while your spirit dies of thirst amidst fountains of wine and spices. He walks to a bronze basin filled with fresh water and plunges his hands in, feeling the thermal shock that awakens him from the lethargy of his glory, observing how the gold of his rings gleams beneath the water, as if trying to escape from his skin. Solomon understands that his fall was not a catastrophic and noisy event, but a silent process of sedimentation, where each small concession to pride created a layer of isolation that now prevents him from feeling the holy tremor of God's presence. He feels the weight of his gray hair and the stiffness in his joints, the signs that biology does not respect royal edicts and that time is performing its own autopsy on the sovereign's body. The thesis of his life now boils down to a diagnosis of saturation. He has discovered that the human heart is an organ of infinite desire that, when satisfied with the finite, enters a state of existential decay. He closes his eyes and feels the vibration of the city beneath his feet, understanding that Jerusalem may be eternal, but the Solomon who built it is merely a fleeting shadow that dissolves in the blinding light of his own vanity. The creaking of the royal harem doors, heavy with silver and exotic wood adornments, emits a sharp sound that ripples through the corridors like the cry of a conscience Solomon has tried to silence for decades. He walks between the silk curtains that tremble in the breeze. You're sensing the suffocating scent of 1,000 different essences mingling in the air, creating an atmosphere where the identity of the God of Israel dissolves into a haze of worldly pleasures. The sweat trickling down his chest, beneath his embroidered tunic, seems to carry the weight of every pagan altar he allowed to be erected on the hills surrounding Jerusalem, transforming the holy city into a map of spiritual infidelity. He observes the gleam of a small bronze idol in the corner of one of the rooms, feeling a nausea that doesn't stem from outward morality, but from the visceral discovery that he is the most intelligent man on earth, and, at the same time, the most enslaved by his own appetites. And the psychology of his downfall reveals that an excess of human affection can be the most effective way to isolate a soul from the presence of the Creator, transforming the King of Israel into a diplomat of his own perdition. The light from the olive oil lamps casts flickering shadows on the walls, revealing the weariness in Solomon's eyelids, which now bear the gaze of one who has possessed all that his eyes coveted, only to discover that desire is a fire that consumes its fuel and never goes out. He touches the parapet of an inner balcony and feels the coldness of the stone, realizing that the voices of his many wives have become a background noise that he can no longer distinguish from the voice of his own fears. There is a persistent tremor in his left hand as he holds a crystal goblet, a sign that the structure of his inner peace is suffering cracks that no political advisor can mend with new treaties or alliances. Perhaps you feel this way when you realize that the concessions you made to be accepted or to maintain peace around you have ended up creating a silent war within your own spirit, leaving you surrounded by people but utterly orphaned of purpose. The danger of a life without limits, like Solomon's, is that freedom transforms into an absence of gravity, where nothing has weight, nothing has value, and the heart floats in a vacuum of indifference and boredom. He observes one of his wives bowed in adoration of a stone deity and feels a chill that doesn't come from the night wind, but from the realization that he is the guardian of a temple he himself is helping to profane through omission and lust. Solomon understands that his wisdom has become a lens that magnifies his guilt, showing with mathematical clarity how each step towards sensory pleasure was a step towards the desert of the soul. He feels the weight of the rings on his fingers, as if they were links in a chain he himself forged, realizing that the gold of Ophir cannot buy a single minute of sleep without the awe that his legacy is being written in sand. The thesis of his agony now is the bankruptcy of pleasure as a source of meaning. He has discovered that the human body has limits to enjoyment, but the human soul has no limits to thirst, and trying to quench the eternal with the temporal is the purest definition of madness. He closes his eyes against the sweet smoke of the incense and feels the pulse of his own decay, realizing that the crown is merely a luxurious ornament on the head of a man who has lost himself within his own dream of grandeur. The weight of the marble beneath Solomon's feet seems to increase with each step he takes toward the courtyards, where the sound of the fountains tries, in vain, to drown out the echo of his advisors' discussions about new taxes and tributes. He observes the mark of his fingers on the stone parapet, a damp stain that quickly disappears under the scorching sun, reminding him of the volatility of his own influence over the hearts of the people who now look at him with a mixture of fear and resentment. The sweat soaking the silk sash at his waist carries with it the acrid odor of the fatigue of one who governs a world of things but has lost sovereignty over his own rest, transforming each night into a battlefield against insomnia and remorse. He feels the vibration of the stones being dragged by slaves in the distant quarries, a tremor that rises through his legs and settles in his chest like a premonition that Israel's physical structure is imposing, but its moral structure is being corroded by greed and idolatry. The psychology of absolute power revealed a cruel side to him. The more he fortifies the borders of the kingdom, the more vulnerable the borders of his sanity become, leaving him at the mercy of thoughts that question whether all this effort is nothing more than a sand castle waiting for the tide to fall. The light reflecting off the golden basins scattered throughout the palace creates a blinding glare that forces Solomon to squint, as a temporary blindness symbolizing how his wealth has prevented him from seeing the spiritual needs festering in the shadows of his buildings. He touches the hilt of a ceremonial dagger, feeling the relief of the precious stones that cut his palm, a physical contact that awakens him to the fact that he has surrounded himself with objects that shine, but lack life or warmth. There is a weariness in his joints that gold cannot lubricate, and a dryness in his throat that the most expensive wine cannot quench. A dehydration of the soul that occurs when man exchanges the fountain of living waters for broken cisterns of immediate pleasure. Perhaps you feel this same weight when you realize that the success you pursued so much has become an armor too heavy to bear, and transforming your routine into a parade of masks where truth is sacrificed on the altar of appearances. The danger of being an architect of destinies, like Solomon, is forgetting that the most important foundation is not what is seen above ground, but the integrity cultivated in the darkness of the heart, far from applause and silver coins. He walks to the center of the great hall and observes the dust shimmering in the air, realizing that each particle of light is an instant that will never return, an accounting of time that makes him feel like a spiritual failure despite his overflowing coffers. Solomon understands that his intelligence was used to dissect the world, but in the process, he dissected his own capacity to marvel at the simplicity of faith, transforming the mystery of God into a logical equation he no longer has any interest in solving. He feels the weight of his own name, a brand that has become greater than the man, forcing him to uphold a legend while the human being behind the crown languishes in an exile of luxury and indifference. Or the thesis of his old age is the recognition of the fallacy of more. He discovered that accumulation does not expand the being, it only buries it, transforming life into an archaeological excavation where he desperately tries to find the mortal remains of his own sincerity. He closes his eyes and feels the pulse of the city outside, a human roar that demands more and more, and understands that he has created a consumerist monster that now demands his own soul as the ultimate sacrifice. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the temple columns now seems like an accusing voice, a whisper that cuts through the golden courtyards and strikes Solomon at the heart of his existential weariness. He watches the smoke from the afternoon sacrifice rising to the sky, but instead of feeling a connection to the divine, he sees only the trace of a ritual that has become mechanical, a choreography of blood and fire that can no longer warm the altar of his heart. The sweat soaking the collar of his royal robe smells of fear, not the reverent awe his father taught him, but the fear of one who realizes that the architecture of his life has been built on crumbling ground. He touches the surface of a marble table and feels the coldness of the material, a temperature that matches the state of his own soul, which has become an impeccable monument on the outside, but icy and empty on the inside. Solomon's psychology at this point is that of a man who has discovered the greatest of human tragedies, the ability to hold the sacred in his hands while the profane governs his mind. Twilight light paints the walls of Jerusalem with a hue of rust and blood, it revealing the scars that time and ambition have left on the face of the sovereign, who now sees himself as a prisoner of his own infrastructure of glory. Solomon looks at a group of priests walking with bowed heads and feels a dull rage as he realizes that he is the architect of that order, but can no longer find his place within it, as if he were a stranger in his own spiritual home. He feels the roughness of the parchment containing his writings on vanity, realizing that each word recorded there was paid for with a drop of his own joy, a painful accounting where the profit of wisdom resulted in the bankruptcy of simple pleasure. Perhaps you recognize yourself in this state of excess baggage, where each new professional or material achievement only adds more weight to a soul that no longer has the strength to walk, to transforming life into a procession of golden burdens. The danger of having everything is that everything ends up occupying the space where hope should flourish, leaving you with a horizon full of things and a heart devoid of tomorrow. He retires to his private chambers, where the silence is so thick he can hear the creaking of cedar fibers in the ceiling beams, a sound of tension mirroring his own emotional structure on the verge of collapse. Solomon removes his crown and places it on a leather stool, observing how the object, without sunlight, seems merely a lifeless, heavy metal circle, incapable of conferring dignity upon one who has lost his peace. He feels a tremor in his legs as he sits on the edge of the bed, realizing that his intelligence, which solved the enigmas of distant kings, but cannot solve the equation of his own chronic insomnia. The thesis of this phase of his life is the confrontation with the irrelevance of power in the face of death. He realizes that, for the earth that reclaims his body, it matters little whether he ruled over gold or over dust. He closes his eyes and tries, for a moment, to forget the weight of being Solomon. But the echo of his own achievements haunts him like a ghost that refuses to rest, reminding him that the price of human glory is the loss of divine tranquility. The reflection of the flames from the oil lamps dances on the cedar walls, creating shadows that seem to whisper the names of gods Solomon should never have known. He observes the trail of ashes the wind has blown into the room, a gray grime that stands out against the impeccable gleam of his jewels, reminding him that, behind the golden facade, the heart of his empire is beginning to smell of death. The sweat trickling down his temples carries the salty taste of regret, a visceral reaction to realizing that the wisdom he used to rule the world was the same wisdom he neglected to rule himself. He feels the texture of a small statue of Astarte that one of his wives left on a table, a cold stone object representing the exact point where his connection to the altar of God shattered into 1,000 pieces of political expediency. Solomon's psychology now reflects that of a man who understands the mechanics of the fall. It wasn't a sudden leap into the abyss, but a slow and silent erosion of every value that his father, David, once defended with blood and tears. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminates the palm of his hand, revealing the network of scars and lines that tell the story of a man who held on to the world too tightly, only to see the meaning of life slip through his fingers. Solomon looks at his ivory throne, now empty in the adjoining hall, and feels a profound nausea as he realizes he has become an idol to his own people, a marble figure that breathes but no longer possesses the warmth of the divine presence that guided him in Gibeon. He feels the weight of his years as if they were layers of lead, a spiritual gravity pulling him down, while his mind, still sharp as a Damascus blade, continues to dissect his own unhappiness with mathematical cruelty. Perhaps you see yourself reflected in this weariness, through realizing that the achievements that should have given you freedom have become the chains that bind you to a routine of appearances and emptiness, transforming your existence into a soulless parade of trophies. The danger of having everything is that you lose the right to complain, becoming trapped in a gilded solitude where your cry for help is muffled by the sound of gold falling into your coffers. He walks to a silver basin and washes his face, feeling the lukewarm water that fails to awaken his spirit from the lethargy that has consumed him for years, watching as the liquid becomes murky with the dust of his own glory. Solomon understands that the thesis of his life has reached its final chapter. He has tasted all waters, climbed all mountains, and slept in all beds, only to discover that the human horizon is a line that recedes as we advance. He feels the tremor in his chest, an irregular beat that sounds like a war drum announcing the invasion of his own mortality, reminding him that the king and the beggar end in the same silence of the earth. The true trap was not wealth, but the illusion that wealth could buy immunity from the pain of being merely a man before the eternal. He closes his eyes and breathes the air laden with smoke and spices, understanding that his greatest wisdom was written not in days of triumph, but in the moment he finally admitted that, without fear, everything under the sun is merely a desperate attempt to embrace the wind. The creaking of the bronze chains that secure the city's great gates echoes through the palace, like the sound of a jaw closing. He's reminding Solomon that his security is, in fact, his greatest confinement. He observes a fly struggling against the transparency of a glass jar from Egypt, realizing that he and the insect share the same fate. Both are trapped in luxurious containers, starving amidst the light. The sweat that stains the seat of his ivory throne leaves a dark and persistent mark, a biological vestige of the agony of a man who has discovered that human wisdom, taken to the extreme, only reveals the size of the abyss that separates us from simplicity. He smells the gold dust that the artisans use to gild the details of the ceiling, a fine dust that seeps into his lungs and seems to transform his own breath into something heavy and metallic, as if his body were being mined from within by his own ambitions. Yet the psychology of this phase of his life is marked by chronic insensitivity. He no longer feels the warmth of the sun or the coolness of the water, only the texture of a boredom that has become more solid than the stones of his own palace. The light from the lamps casts its shadow on the mosaic floor, an elongated and distorted silhouette that resembles a weary giant, a faithful reflection of how he feels in the face of history and himself. Solomon looks at his hands and sees neither the strength of the warrior his father was, nor the innocence of the young man who asked for discernment, but only the pallor of someone who spent decades signing death decrees and taxes to maintain a glory that now seems unbearable to him. He feels the roughness of the linen against his irritated skin, a physical discomfort that keeps him anchored in the reality that pleasure, when it becomes an obligation, is the most refined form of torture. Perhaps his own success today has become white noise that prevents him from hearing his own heartbeat, transforming his life into a series of automatic tasks where meaning has been replaced by productivity. The danger of having everything under control, like Solomon, is that you end up controlling a graveyard of dreams, where the only thing that grows is the longing for a time when need was the driving force behind your prayers. He rises and walks to the bronze mirror, observing how the polished metal distorts the features of his face, giving him the appearance of a death mask even before the end. Solomon understands that the thesis of his downfall was written with the ink of self-sufficiency. He ceased to need God because he learned to manufacture his own miracles through economics and diplomacy. He feels the tremor in his neck, a throbbing that warns him that the time of his reign is running out and that the throne of Israel will be left to hands that do not know the weight of his sacrifice. The nausea that overwhelms him at the thought of the kingdom's future is a reminder that nothing he built with his own hands can survive the erosion of the soul that he allowed to happen in the secrecy of his chambers. He closes his eyes and feels the air heavy with smoke and expensive perfumes, understanding that true wealth is the capacity to desire what is eternal, and that he, in his abundance, has become the poorest man who ever ruled over the sacred dust of Jerusalem. In the rhythmic sound of water falling into the bronze basins of the hanging gardens, now seems to Solomon like the sound of an hourglass leaking endlessly, a countdown to an oblivion that not even all the marble of Lebanon can prevent. He observes the petals of an exotic flower wilting under the Jerusalem heat, seeing in it the reflection of his own vitality, dried up under the weight of 1,000 commitments that did not include the altar. The sweat running down his neck, under the weight of his long, anointed hair, carries the scent of perfumed oils that can no longer hide the smell of a soul in moral decay. He feels the texture of a small iron key he carries on his belt, the key to a private treasure he no longer has any interest in opening, and for he knows that what lies within is only material proof that he has traded the eternal for the fleeting. Solomon's psychology at this stage is that of a man who feels like a ghost inhabiting a monument in his own memory, someone who has already died inside, but whom the crown still compels to walk and talk. The orange light of the late afternoon falls on the golden shields hanging in the vestibule, creating a gleam that Solomon avoids with his gaze, for each reflection reminds him of the original brilliance he lost when he stopped fearing God and began to fear the opinions of men. He looks at his feet, shod in fine leather sandals, and realizes that they have trod paths that his father, David, would never have dared to tread. Paths paved with the arrogance of one who considered himself above the law for being the possessor of wisdom. He feels the tremor in his hands as he tries to untangle a silk thread from his cloak, a simple gesture that becomes impossible in the face of the nervous fatigue of one who has spent his life trying to reconcile heaven with hell in his own routine. Perhaps you feel this same exhaustion, the weight of trying to maintain a life structure that seems magnificent to those who look from the outside, but which you know is hollow inside, sustained only by the strength of a will that no longer has joy. The danger of being a giant like Solomon is that when you fall, there's no one around strong enough to catch you, leaving only the dry impact against the reality of your own mortality. He walks to the parapet of his highest tower and watches the lights of Jerusalem lighting up one by one, like earthly stars trying to compete with the firmament, and but needing oil and a wick to survive. Solomon understands that the very essence of his existence has become a warning to all generations. The brightest mind on earth is capable of committing the greatest follies when the heart disconnects from the source of life. He feels the weight of the night air, which carries the scent of damp earth and distant animals, and realizes that nature continues its cycle, indifferent to his royal decrees or his existential dilemmas. The nausea that consumes him is the recognition that he has become a master at giving advice he himself can no longer hear, a doctor who knows the cure but has chosen to drink the poison of self-sufficiency. He closes his eyes and feels the pulse of his own mortality beat against his temple, an understanding that the end of all things is much closer than the brilliance of any achievement, and that true wisdom would have been to remain small before the one who made him great. The metallic sound of a bronze plate falling somewhere in the royal kitchens echoes like thunder in the empty corridors, jolting Solomon from a trance where he contemplated not God, but nothingness itself. He observes the grease stain a lamp left on the Carrara marble, a persistent mark symbolizing how his legacy has been defiled by alliances he swore were strategic, but which were merely spiritual adulteries disguised as diplomacy. The sweat trickling between his shoulder blades carries the weight of 1,000 altars he did not destroy. A cold dampness that makes him tremble beneath his purple robe, in reminding him that the king of Israel is now merely a caretaker of foreign idols. He feels the roughness of a wound on his lip, the result of the anxiety that gnaws from within when the silence of the sky becomes so thick it can be felt on the skin. A divine muteness that is the price of those who traded revelation for information. Salomon's psychology at this moment is that of a man who has discovered that human wisdom is a knife without a handle. It cuts through doubt, but mortally wounds the hand that holds it without the fear that protects it. The light from dying torches on the walls casts shadows that resemble priests of silent gods, surrounding the king in a liturgy of despair where the incense smells of burnt flesh and the wine tastes of desert dust. Solomon looks at his own feet, adorned with golden sandals, and feels an overwhelming envy of the steps of his father, David, who even fleeing through caves had sacred ground beneath his feet, while he, atop his palace, treads on an ornate void. An existential nausea rises in his throat as he realizes that he has built an infrastructure for eternity, but inhabits a soul that rots in cycles of instant gratification and perpetual boredom. Perhaps you too feel this weight, the weariness of carrying a name that demands more than your truth can deliver, transforming your life into a successful performance while the backstage of your heart is filled with rubble and moral ruin. The danger of being a management genius, like Solomon, is that you learn to manage your distance from God, creating a religious bureaucracy that keeps the sacred far enough away not to disturb your sins. He approaches a large papyrus map depicting the extent of his empire, from the river to the land of the Philistines, and feels the urge to tear the paper, which displays a grandeur he no longer possesses within. Solomon realizes that his life's thesis has failed at its most crucial point. He believed he could understand the meaning of life through total experience, without realizing that certain experiences are poisons that destroy the palate for truth. He feels a tremor in his neck, a throbbing that warns him that the time of grace is closing, while the scent of cedar and spices begins to resemble the smell of an embalming done in life. The conclusion he writes, gazing at the horizon of Jerusalem, is bitter and final. The man who gains the whole world and loses the fear of God is not a conqueror, but merely a collector of ashes in a glass palace. He closes his eyes and feels the weight of the crown, understanding that true sovereignty is not about ruling over men, but about being ruled by the one who created them, a right he traded for a bowl of lentils made of gold and lust. The crackling of the embers in the silver braziers now sounds like the ticking of an hourglass whose grains are made of ground bones, reminding Solomon that even the most solid cedar pillar is merely food for time. He observes the dust that accumulates in the folds of his royal robe, a fine dirt that gold cannot repel, symbolizing the inertia of a soul so accustomed to abundance that it has forgotten the taste of need. The sweat that runs down his chest, beneath the ceremonial breastplate, carries the odor of a body that is alive, but of a spirit that already feels buried under the weight of 1,000 talents of silver and 1,000 regrets of marble. He feels the texture of the handle of his writing pen, a piece of ivory that once recorded all the laws of nature, but which now trembles before the task of recording its own inner bankruptcy. Solomon's psychology has reached the point of critical saturation. He is like a diver who has descended too deep into the waters of pleasure, and now feels the pressure of the ocean crushing his lungs, unsure if he still has enough breath to emerge to the surface of truth. The moonlight, cold and surgical, filters through the openings in the ceiling and illuminates the palace floor, revealing the almost imperceptible cracks in the polished stones. A visual metaphor for how sin, however subtle, ends up fragmenting the structure of even the wisest soul. Solomon looks at his hands and sees in them the pallor of someone who has spent too much time in the shadow of the temples he himself profaned, hands that should be raised in pure worship, but which are heavy with rings representing commitments to what is perishable. He feels the harshness of his own voice as he tries to whisper a prayer, realizing that the words come out dry, like autumn leaves blown by a wind that brings no rain, revealing the spiritual desert he cultivated with the fertilizer of intellectual pride. Perhaps you feel this way today, realizing that the life you have built is a decorated desert, where the mirages of success and status can no longer hide the thirst of a soul that was made for the infinite, but which is being fed with crumbs of human glory. And the danger of being a master of solutions, like Solomon, is that you develop an arrogance that prevents you from recognizing yourself as the problem, turning spirituality into an object of study instead of a force for transformation. He walks to the large central chandelier and observes the flame struggling to remain lit against the draft of air entering through the open windows, seeing in it the image of his own integrity, about to be extinguished by the storm of his choices. Solomon understands that the final thesis of his agony is not about the loss of wealth, but about the loss of the capacity to love what is invisible. He has become so addicted to what he can touch, measure, and weigh, that the spiritual world has become for him an abstract and distant theory. He feels the tremor in his neck, more an accelerated pulse that alerts him to the fact that the glory of this world is a drug that requires ever-increasing doses to produce an ever smaller effect, inevitably leading to an overdose of nihilism. The nausea that overwhelms him when he looks at his own reflection is the beginning of his final lesson. The discovery that the richest man in the world is the one who has nothing to hide from God, and that he, with all his treasure, is the most miserable beggar who ever wore a crown of golden thorns. He closes his eyes and breathes in the cold night air, feeling the weight of each decision, and understands that returning to the altar is the only journey still worth making, even if he has to walk over the ruins of his own empire to get there. The silence that now settles in the throne room is heavier than the gold of Ophir, or a sonorous void where Solomon can hear the grinding of the gears of his own mortality. He observes the shadow of a column projected onto the marble, realizing that, like that dark stain, his glory is merely the absence of light in a body that should be transparent to the presence of God. The sweat that trickles down his temples under the pressure of the crown carries the odor of a sacrifice that was not accepted, a bitter dampness that reminds him that he became a master of external rituals while the inner sanctuary of his soul is in ruins. He feels the texture of the parchment under his fingers, where the ink is still fresh, recording the final verdict of a life spent chasing the wind. The realization that human wisdom, when it becomes an end in itself, is merely a sophisticated form of madness. But Solomon's psychology is now that of a man walking among the ruins of his own genius, seeing in each monument he erected the material proof of his own spiritual orphanhood. The pale light of dawn begins to filter through the wooden trellises, revealing the futility of the lamps that burned all night. A perfect image of how his intellectual effort failed to illuminate the darkness emanating from his own heart. Solomon looks at his hands, now trembling and stained with ink, and feels a deep disgust at the ease with which he managed to deceive the world, maintaining the facade of a wise king while becoming a beggar of fleeting pleasures. He feels the weight of the centuries to come, the awareness that his name will be used for generations to describe glory. but rarely to describe the anguish of one who had everything and discovered that everything is an insufficient amount to fill the void left by God. Perhaps you recognize yourself in this diagnosis of empty fullness, where your life is an inventory of achievements that fail to warm your spirit when the stage lights go out and you are left alone with the truth. The danger of being a giant like Solomon is the loneliness at the top, where there is no one to tell you that your gold is just painted lead and that your wisdom is merely a delusion of grandeur. He walks to the parapet and sees the first ray of sunlight touch the top of the temple. A golden glow that once would have made him fall to his knees, but now only hurts his eyes. Weary of so much purposeless beauty, Solomon understands that the final thesis of his journey is not about what he has accumulated, but about what he has allowed to be stolen from his center. The fear that is the beginning of everything. He feels the tremor in his chest, a beat that resonates like a hammer striking a cold stone altar, warning that the time for playing with the sacred is over, and that the account of his stewardship is being presented. The nausea that overwhelms him is the awakening of a soul that slept in a cradle of gold while its house was burning. A late but necessary awakening, so that the last words of his book are not of despair, but of warning. He closes his eyes and breathes in the pure morning air, feeling the weight of the crown as a final opportunity to bow. Understanding that Solomon's greatest wisdom was not given by God at the beginning, but gained in the pain of the end, that being a servant in anonymity is greater than being a king in divine oblivion. The sound of the morning wind now whips the silk flags on the terraces, a dry noise that sounds like the tearing of an old contract, reminding Solomon that the time of diplomacy with sin has finally expired. He observes the golden dust that glitters suspended in the sunbeam, realizing that he has spent his life trying to capture this light with his hands, only to discover that the glitter is an optical illusion, and what remains on his palms is merely the dirt of the road. The sweat that dries on his skin leaves a saline crust, a physical bitterness that mirrors the state of his spirit, which has become a well of brackish waters where nothing of life can flourish. He feels the stiffness of his fingers as he tries to hold the royal staff, a weight that is no longer a symbol of authority, but a walking stick for a man who has stumbled over his own intelligence and fallen into the abyss of self-sufficiency. Solomon's psychology now reaches its peak of clarity. He understands that true wisdom is not the accumulation of facts or the control of nations, but the preservation of the capacity to be vulnerable before the Creator. Sunlight now floods the temple, but Solomon turns his back on the exterior glare and focuses on the inner darkness of his private study, where the smell of old parchment and squid ink creates a silent courtroom atmosphere. He looks at his reflection in the bronze and sees not David's successor, but a man who has become the monument of his own ruin, someone who traded the eternity of a relationship with God for the temporality of 1,000 pleasures that now rot in his memory. He feels the weight of every word he wrote in his days of deviation, realizing that the greatest pain of a wise man is knowing exactly where he went wrong, and yet feeling the paralysis of a soul that has become accustomed to golden chains. Perhaps you feel this same numbness, the terrifying realization that you know the way back, but the weight of the things you have accumulated prevents you from taking the first step towards simplicity. The danger of having reached the summit, like Solomon, is discovering that the view from up there is merely a panoramic reminder of everything you sacrificed to be alone on the peak. He sits down at his writing desk for the last time and dips his pen into the ink, feeling the final tremor in his wrist, a movement no longer of doubt, but of absolute surrender to the stark truth. Solomon understands that the final thesis of his life is intellectual repentance. He needs to tell the world that the search for meaning outside the altar is a circular race that ends in an ornate tomb. He feels the vibration of the air in his lungs, a breath he now uses to blow away the ashes of his vanity and reveal the only remaining cornerstone, the fear of the Lord. The nausea that has accompanied him for years finally dissipates, giving way to a holy sadness, a melancholy that is, in fact, the beginning of healing for the heart that tried to be God and discovered it could barely be human. He closes his eyes, and he feels the weight of the crown on the table, a soulless circle of metal, and understands that the end of all things is, in fact, the only beginning that truly matters for those who wish to find peace beyond the sun. The crunch of the pen against the parchment is the only sound that fills the emptiness of the royal hall, a dry noise that marks the end of an era of excess and the beginning of a painful lucidity. Solomon watches the last drop of ink dry on the word vanity, realizing that this term is not a philosophical concept, but the tombstone of every minute he lived away from the simplicity of the altar. The sweat that now dries on his face brings a strange feeling of lightness, as if, by admitting his own bankruptcy, he had finally freed himself from the burden of having to be the wisest man on earth. He feels the texture of the leather cover of his final book, a material that once represented luxury, but which is now merely the wrapping of a warning that will echo through the centuries. That the sun rises and sets over empires of dust, but the word of the eternal is the only rock that does not dissolve in the tide of time. Solomon's psychology at the close of his life is that of a shipwrecked man who stopped fighting the current and accepted being carried back to the shore of divine dependence, where weakness is the only strength that truly matters. The light of dusk now recedes from Jerusalem, leaving the temple in a majestic twilight that Solomon can finally contemplate without the filter of pride or possession. He looks at his empty hands, stripped of rings and seals, and feels a warmth that gold could never provide, or the warmth of a soul that has stopped trying to be the center of the universe to become merely a reflection of someone else's glory. He smells the rain that begins to fall on the hot limestone of the city, a scent of renewal that reminds him that the earth, even exhausted by cultivation, always has a chance to flourish when touched by the sky. Perhaps his own weariness, which brought him to the end of this video, is a silent invitation for you too to let go of the tools of building your own palace of anxieties and begin to dig the foundation of a peace that does not depend on bank balances or the recognition of men. Solomon's danger was having everything. Solomon's redemption was discovering that without the fear of the Lord, everything is the noisiest way of having nothing. He rises, places the scroll on the table, and walks towards the darkness at the back of the hall, not like a king fleeing the light, but like a man who has finally found rest in the shadows of the Almighty. Solomon understands that the thesis of his life is complete. Wisdom is not what you know, but whom you fear, and wealth is not what you accumulate, but what you are willing to lose to gain eternity. He feels the last strong beat in his chest, a beat of authority that closes the chapter of his agony and opens the portal to his royal legacy, signaling to the world that the quest is over and that the goal was finally reached the moment he gave up on himself. Nausea gave way to peace, boredom gave way to hope, and the great King Solomon, son of David, now closes his eyes under the sun of Israel, leaving behind a trail of gold and ashes, but pointing, with a trembling finger, to the only thing that truly matters: fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of every man.